think we will start the webinar here. Welcome to our webinar. We are speaking on behalf of the Coachella Valley Waterkeeper today, a program that's part of the Orange County Coastkeeper. And my name is Adam Curlin. I'm a law clerk with the Coachella Valley Waterkeeper and the Orange County Coastkeeper. I'm also a student at Loyola Law School. And I'm here with Barry Lee.
Yeah, hi, I'm Barry Lee. I'm a law clerk also, and I'm at Chapman University.
So today, our webinar, we're going to be discussing the National Environmental Policy Act, which goes better known by the phrase NEPA. We're going to do an overview of the NEPA process. We're going to then show you how, as a member of the public, that you can get involved and stay informed when an action is subject to NEPA review. We're going to use actions that are happening around the Salton Sea that are specifically with the Salton Sea Management Program as examples in this presentation. Barry's going to be walking you through how to access the Federal Register, among other ways that you can get access to information. And we're going to try to look specifically at the proposed North Lake concept that's part of the SSMP in the Salton Sea, which is a compilation of actions. And we're also going to look at a past action that occurred as part of the SSMP, which was the Species Conservation Habitat Project. But first, what is NEPA? So NEPA is often described as the United States environmental umbrella law, in that the law itself mandates a specific review process. It is in consideration of other environmental laws and other civil rights laws, and it evaluates the possible harm that could occur due to actions where the federal government is involved. And an action is subject to NEPA specifically if the action is authorized, funded, or if it is approved by the federal government. So one of the things that, it's a kind of a complicated process. So the NEPA Citizens Guide, which you can get at nepa.gov, and Barry can show you a little bit how to get there as well, is going to, there's a process that they've outlined with a flow chart. And it's really helpful for going through the NEPA review process. So the first thing that happens with the NEPA review process is an agency is going to identify the need for an action. We're up here at the top box. And they have to develop a proposal. So a NEPA project could be a part of could be a combination of agencies, could be a state lead agency. In the case of the Salton Sea Management Plan, it is. But there's always going to be a lead federal agency who's going to be in charge of the NEPA process specifically. In the Salton Sea, it's the Army Corps who's in charge. So they're going to then, that lead federal agency is going to ask the question while they're developing this plan to say, are the environmental effects of this action likely to be significant? And the answer to that question will dictate the process itself. So there are three outcomes, and we're going to start with the one on the far right here, labeled number 8, which is if the action will have significant environmental effects, or that it's possible that they may have significant environmental effects. So if that occurs, if that's the answer to that question, then they're going to have to make an environmental impact statement. And so, what is an environmental impact statement? Well, it's a document. It's an analytic document which goes through what will happen or what might happen due to this action. And it's known as an EIS, and probably use that as shorthand for this webinar. So an EIS is going to also have to review alternative actions that might that could be another way of handling the issue at the core of the action. And so it'll review the initial proposed action, the alternatives, and then at the end of it, it'll make a suggestion of the best way to handle the action with the least environmental impact. So really the process for creating an EIS starts with a notice of intent. The notice of intent to prepare a draft EIS specifically, which it doesn't say in this chart. They first have to make a draft one. So the notice of intent will appear in the Federal Register. The agency will publish that. And that'll give you information on how you can get involved in this process writ large. So it'll give you some agency contacts, where public meetings are, et cetera. But what the notice of intent does is it kicks off the public scoping process. And what does that mean, right? It's kind of jargony. The public scoping process is really that is going to dictate what the NEPA review process is in terms of creating this EIS. So what's the timeline? What are the kind of, where are these there's going to be specific meeting times that they're going to highlight. It'll give you sort of the overview of what the project is. But during this scoping process, when a notice of intent has been published, but before the draft EIS has been created, you as a member of the public can weigh in. You can actually suggest alternatives that they're not considering. You can perhaps even suggest data that they should be collecting. There's ways to actually shape the actual review process at that point. So that will end, that public scoping process will end once they create the draft EIS. And I should highlight that getting involved during the public scoping process is going to be the most fruitful, because you have the most ability to shape the process itself. So once the draft EIS is created, they're going to also publish a notice of availability. The agency will publish that notice in the Federal Register, and you can then go ahead and access the draft EIS, which won't be on the Federal Register. It'll be published elsewhere. You could view it in person most times. You can then probably get a copy. It just depends. There's no strict rules, but it'll tell you how to get that. Now, once that draft EIS is published, there's a public review period. And so you get to read it, comment on it, and those comments will be, if they're substantive comments, they have to be addressed by the agency. And so the agency will take these comments and they will review them, and if they're substantive, meaning if they actually address the issue itself and are frivolous, they're going to then have to include them in their final EIS that they publish, and those comments have to be addressed. They could be addressed by making changes to that initial draft EIS that they had, or it could be reasons why your comment is not going to be addressed or is not going to change the document itself. But if it's substantive, they have to address it in some way. Now, like I just mentioned, those comments and the way that they address it will be in the final EIS. And there will be a notice of availability for that final EIS in the Federal Register. And that will then get published again on a website, will be available in person somewhere. And based on that information, the agency decision maker in this case for Salton Sea, the Army Corps of Engineers, will decide on which action they're going to take, if they're going to take one at all. The way this is actually run is they actually have to take 30 days between the publishing of the final EIS and making a decision, which allows them to really weigh in and understand the document, so it's not just rushed through. So then what happens if the answer to this question, the second box up here, is that the environmental effects are unknown? Well, then there's a sort of a stopgap, a little middle ground process, which is when the agency will have to create an environmental assessment. So an environmental assessment is basically it's less of a rigorous analytic document, and really what they're trying to figure out is, are the environmental effects, is there going to be no significant environmental effects? And if the answer is, if there are going to be some, they have to then create a EIS. So it's sort of, you see this arrow here, it'll kick it back up. So there's two outcomes, as I mentioned. If they find no significant environmental effects, then they'll just go through to make a decision and then go into implementation. If they find that there's some, they got to go back through that review process we just described in creating an EIS. So what's worth noting about the environmental assessment track is that doesn't have the same procedure of an EIS in terms of the public's involvement. An agency could create their own rules and their own specifics for how you would actually get involved as a member of the public. It says that the agency should bring in the public to basically what makes sense for the agency. It's very loose. Typically, though, it really follows the same guidelines and the same procedure as an EIS. Okay, so in the terms of the Army Corps in the past Salton Sea projects, they still published a notice of intent to prepare an environmental assessment. They still had a public scoping period. They still published a draft environmental assessment. It went through the same procedures, although there was just less meeting times and a little bit less involvement, but keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind for both an environmental assessment and a environmental impact statement is that an action could be included in like an overview, what they call a programmatic review. And what that means is that instead of just analyzing one specific action, so if it's like a dust suppression action, right, they're going to review a dust suppression action, a habitat conservation action, a number of different actions all tied together in terms of a program. So they'll look at an area and say, okay, we're going to evaluate all of these actions at once. That's in some ways that's great because it'll end up speeding up the overall process for all the actions. But it will take longer than just a regular single action review. So what's to keep in mind if you find out something's a programmatic environmental assessment or a programmatic environmental impact statement is you really want to get involved as early as possible, because if that's the case, then you will have more opportunity to shape so many different actions, and you really do want to get involved as soon as possible. So keep that in mind. Now, if the action is there's also this third track, and what this third track is when the action itself is excluded from review. So each agency will have a list of actions that are categorical exclusions. And so these are published initially in the Federal Register. They appear in their procedures and they'll be listed. And a categorical exclusion could be something as simple as like a personnel decision, which would likely not have any environmental impact. But it could be something like in the case of the Army Corps, they have like boat hoists are an example of a categorical exclusion. So that if that's there, that would just automatically be removed from NEPA review. However, the agency decision maker, when they look at this, they can say, you know what, in the case of this specific boat hoist, there's going to be some environmental impacts. There's extraordinary circumstances to this particular installation. So we're going to actually have to put this through NEPA review. And as you see from the nifty arrow that they provided, kicks it right back up to the environmental assessment track. And then it'll go through the same thing. And there's significant environmental effects. It'll go to creating an EIS. So in all circumstances, they'll create a record of decision, and then they can move forward with implementation at that point. And so the other thing to keep in mind beyond categorical exclusions is that Congress does have two ways that they will remove an action or actually modify the action in the NEPA review process. That is when there is an emergency, and that is when there is classified information. So there's specifics on that in each agency's procedures, but just be aware that there are instances where an action may be removed from traditional NEPA review. So the last thing I want to highlight is that if you are a member of the public and you are trying to be involved in the process and the agency is not making it easy, making it difficult, or not including you, there is a way to actually have mediation. The CEQ, the Council on Environmental Quality, provides a resource with the Udall Foundation to actually mediate when there's conflict in the NEPA process. So worst case scenario, you can reach out to the contacts there at the bottom of the page on their main page and let them know that you're having issues with one of the NEPA agencies. So now that basically sums up the entire NEPA review process. I'm going to kick this over to Barry Lee, who's going to walk you through access in the Federal Register, among some other ways you can actually get involved. So you go, Barry.
Thank you. So I'm going to show you guys how to do some of the things that Adam just talked about. I'm going to first start with the notice of intent, which happens when there is significant environmental effect. And as Adam said, you want to get involved as soon as you can. So you want to be aware of the NOI. So first you go to the Federal Register. And you could type in, let's say you're looking for information about the Salton Sea. And you want to type it in quotes because it's not Google and it's not quite as smart. You can filter things out based on the filters on the left. So for example, we're looking for the NOI, the notice of intent to do an environmental impact statement. I click on notice, filter by, and then you can also filter by agency. And in the case of the Salton Sea, we're looking at the Engineer Corps. So there's two links here left, and the second one you can see is already the notice of intent. This isn't for the current management plan, but we're using it as an example because the current plan is not very far along in the NEPA process. This is a pretty typical looking one. If you go about halfway down the page, you see comments and questions regarding the scoping process can be addressed to the relevant authorities here. You have names and addresses and phone numbers. If I go towards the bottom, you can see that there are meeting locations, times, dates, locations, and this is where you can have your voice heard. Similarly, when you're doing your final, if you want to find the final EIS or the decision, this is the same way you'd find it through the Federal Register. I also want to show you that if you want to keep up with everything, type in Salton Sea, and you can on your right you can subscribe. And this way, every time anything is regarding the Salton Sea is published on the Federal Register, you are notified by email. You would have to make an account. I already made one, so it normally would be right around here. I also want to show you, in this case, the state lead agency is the California Natural Resources Agency. And on the previous page, I know that because it's on the previous page on the notice of intent. You can go to saltonsea.ca.gov. And if you go all the way to the bottom, you can also subscribe to their listserv, and that's a similar idea. You put in your email, they're going to give you all they're going to forward you a lot of information as the process goes on. Yeah, the EIS is typically, the notice of intent to do the environmental impact statement is really important because you're going to want to get in as soon as possible, as Adam said, because you're offering alternative options and stuff like that. And the further along they are, the less likely they're going to listen. But yeah, if you have any questions, you can forward them to legal@coastkeeper.org. Or if you have any.
I also just want to highlight to everyone that we understand that NEPA is a complicated process and there's a lot of terminology here, but I think just the takeaways here from this webinar is really, like Barry just said, to get in as early as possible, identify these lead agencies, and basically you want to be able to stay involved as much as you can, stay on top of it, because so much there's going to be so many different agencies kind of coming in and out of both for CEQA and NEPA that you really just want to make sure that you access the information early and you don't get left behind in the process. Okay. Well, then we appreciate you guys coming to the webinar, and thank you for joining.